ladies and gentlemen, if we could begin. It gives me intense pleasure to introduce Toni Morrison, who will need no introduction, obviously, to all of you, and whom I have admired immensely for many years. We're going to talk for about sort of half an hour about Toni's work, and then we shall move on to questions from the floor. So I'd like to start by asking the usual sort of banal question. When did you first realize you were a writer, and how did you begin?
I realized I was a writer. I began to use the word writer and call myself a writer only after I had written 3 books. I was always reluctant to use the word on the forms that the income tax people send you, on the passport applications. And I was not even interested in why. I was always an editor who wrote or a teacher who also wrote. And those problems, I'm sure, run deep in perhaps women writing or minorities writing or what have you. But I began writing without ever using that word, I am a writer. And I think I began because I really, and I'm sorry if it sounds a little facile, but I really wanted to read that book.
Yeah.
And it didn't exist.
How old were you?
I was over 30. I didn't start as a young, aspiring writer. I was a reader, and I thought everything that I needed to know had been written, and all I had to do was find it. But at some point, for a number of reasons, I wanted to read a certain kind of book that I couldn't find. And the whole act of writing for me at that time was almost like a long read that took 3 or 4 years. In the case of the first book I wrote, The Bluest Eye, it took 5 years. That was a sustained process because if I didn't like the way it read, then I would change it, you see. But perhaps that was really a kind of a subtle protection of actually entering into a field that I thought was theirs or someone else's. Or
what was it that you wanted to read in The Bluest Eye that you hadn't met anywhere else?
I really wanted to see what it would be like if a black child held the stage. They had always been peripheral in texts. They had always been somebody's prop or a joke or comic relief or tragic notes. But they had never held the stage. A feminine perception, a child's perception, or my recollection. And all of those memories, what it had really been like. Mind you, this book I was writing in 1965, and at that time there was a great deal of, I don't know, talk, civil rights movement was going on, and lots of books and pamphlets and so on. And I suddenly thought, suppose it all works. And I wake up tomorrow morning in a country in which there is true democracy, true equality, and it's all over. And I said, oh no, but that can't happen. It's as though they will have forgotten that it really wasn't that easy. It really wasn't like that. It wasn't like the headlines in the newspapers. It wasn't like that. It was different. I lived in a very small town in Ohio. It was different. And I wanted, I guess, to remember it myself that way and read about it. And then, of course, the process of writing took over, and all my yearnings got either evaporated or dissipated in the act of really trying to write. Writing is different from thinking. I mean, you really are compelled to make it work, not in that sort of daydreamy, yearning, strange way, but now you have only those 26 letters in the alphabet. That's all you've got, and it's got to work.
What else were you doing at the time you were writing in the 60s? Were you?
I was teaching at Howard University at the very beginning, but in 1965, I started working in a publishing house. And I was doing, for 5 years, I think, I did textbook publishing, and then I went into trade book publishing at Random House, and I did that until very recently, actually, about 3 or 4 years ago.
And you went back to teaching?
Then I went back to teaching, yes.
And the next books, were they easier or more difficult? And were they out of the same need to establish something that needed to be remembered, which you spoke
The
of.
second one certainly was. After I had finished the first one, The Bluest Eye, I knew that I never, ever wanted to be without that something going on. And irrespective of other people and the publishers and what the response would be, I wanted to live in that place. It was mine, it was private, it was literally the only thing I did that was only for me.
This is very interesting because you say it was private, which I think is anything any writer feels.
Yes.
This is where I work it out. This is where my vision pertains. And yet you must, because you're a woman and because you're black, be also a representative person for a large number of people. How do you reconcile these things?
Well, I've just decided to change the definitions altogether. In the beginning, I was very astonished at responses to work. Well-meaning white people would say, I really loved your work. I know that you wrote it for black people, or I know it's black, but I really loved it. And I would say, yes. I've been reading all these things by Russians and French people, and I really, what was the problem? Then black people would say, particularly about The Bluest Eye, I really liked that book, but I really was furious with you because you let them know about it. At the same time. Like, this was our information, this was our, and now they, meaning white people, have access to it. Well, you can't write a book and decide who is going to read it. So that there was some ambivalence, and I realized that something representative was there, whether I wanted it or not, and something non-representative as well. So I used to ask people, what does that mean when someone says, I know you didn't write it for me, but I really enjoyed it too? What are they saying? I understood the other complaint. And then I used to get questions like, are you, do you consider yourself a black writer? Or, what, a real writer? As a matter of fact, I was introduced that way quite recently by a very famous author whom I adore and who adores me, and who simply got up and said, I have always loved Toni Morrison's work, and I have never thought of her as a woman writer. I have never thought of her as a black writer. I was sitting with, some other people, some people who were getting some awards, some women, and I have always thought of her as, and I turned to the women and I said, a male writer, a white male writer. So we started to laugh. Well, it's too bad, because the vocabulary puts you in a place where you've got to react to it. You have to say, no, I'm not a black writer, I'm a writer. Or no, I'm not a woman writer, I'm a writer. Or, as I do, I say, yes, I am a black woman writer. And that makes my world larger than those who are neither. But it's all trickery and chicanery in dealing with the labels that writers have to live with.
Well, it's partly to do with having lived in a time when writing has become part of large political movements, and some people do write in order to represent movements, which is
indeed
a different thing again from the private original compulsion, although it can be part of it as one, as you say, one's.
Oh yes, I really would like to write books that are political in the fine sense of that word. That is to say, it has teeth, and there is something in it about the world in which we live. But I insist on doing the very best I can to make them beautiful. And those two things don't seem to exclude one another.
On the contrary, no.
They should be.
They should
go hand in hand.
Which means that each book has to be particular.
That's right. It has to be its own
and not
self.
representative, and yet it's no good if it's not.
That's right.
When you came on to later works such as, for instance, Song of Solomon, you were indeed thought of very much as a beautiful writer, a writer who used an immensely ornate and complicated language and structure, which is something I think you feel also somehow double about.
Oh, yes, I hear in the States how ornate and rich, and for those who are not taken with it, excessive my language is. And I suppose in spots they may be right, but my effort is to be as simple as possible. To say, he picked up the shoe, or they closed the door. At some point, that's what it is. And you have to, I have to write over and over and over again to make the work look like I did not. If the work shows that it hasn't been done. And I'm not always able to do that, or I think I am, and then 5 years later I read it and I realize I needed more time. But that's the point is to write in such a fashion that you don't see the sweat. You only see what is there, and I try to write simply, elegantly, I hope, at some moments, but nevertheless in such a way that the reader is very much involved in making that book, that is to say, bringing so much of what he or she has that what they take away may be complicated, rich, and ornate, but not because the language is. It's, you know, if the actress is crying, the audience probably isn't. The skill is to not do it and make the emotion take place outside yourself. And that has to be done out of a very cold, clear, intelligent place.
Yes, one of the things I felt about Beloved when I opened it with a kind of shock of recognition was that here was, in a sense, the most terrible subject matter that could be. And it was told with a sort of mixture of coldness and absolute delight that left me feeling partly ashamed of white people, I must say, you know, really badly ashamed. But much more than that, a kind of sort of aesthetic exultance at the end of it. I felt sort of, you know, it's been said, and somebody's actually been able so strong that they've taken pleasure in saying it. Because when you say cold, there's also the pleasure.
Indeed, and I have been happy to hear people say precisely that. I enjoyed it. I guess I shouldn't have, but I enjoyed the work. The point being that I'm writing, as you say, about something that has probably no peer, lasted a long, long time. And that is a kind of a void in the literature of the United States. It's sort of not there. And I want to go there. I want the reader to join me. And I don't want ever to blink, and I want my gaze to be unblinking. But I don't want it so formidable that it can't be absorbed, it can't be read. It was a problem for me as a writer. I thought I knew all I needed to know about that subject, and I didn't. And I would be exhausted with staying in that company for years, or with the knowledge of a certain level of pain and being bereft. And I would say to myself, well, if they could live it, then maybe I can just sort of write about it. I'm not going to be there always. But I wanted, as I think I mentioned to Toni earlier, I gave the manuscript to a friend who is not in the world of literature and so on, but someone whom I trust and whom I love. And I asked her when she finished the manuscript, and she had no obligation to, you know, be literary about it and tell me interesting, clever things. And I knew that. And so when she finished it, she said, well, what can I say? And I said, how did you feel when you finished it? And she said, all right. I felt fine. I felt just fine. And I knew what she meant, is that she had made the journey, the process of doing it, painful, but there were moments when there was fun. I mean, it was very, you know, engineered moments of lightness, when I was trying to guide the reader through this journey in such a way that you could go there. It's got to be accessible. It's got to be, I kept saying, it cannot be beyond art. It can't be. If it is, then they've won and I've lost. I've got to be able to translate it because art can do that. Art can do what other things cannot do.
It's, what follows from that really is that part of the form of Beloved is that it excludes at every point. The people won't remember certain things. The world of the white people and the world of the Civil War doesn't appear, although it's a given datum of what's going on. I feel you chose this technique of exclusion in order to enable the art to deal with it. Could you say something about that?
I thought that if I had put the Civil War there, or even the institution, it would have central place. Then it would get to be, it would disappoint me as a writer to have to deal with it, but also it would require that I dissipate the energy from the interior life of those people. And also, I wanted the structure to be one in which the process of memory, of trying very hard not to remember and failing at it, so that the reader doesn't want to hear it. I really don't want to write it. They don't want to remember it. Nobody wants to say it. They have to be forced into saying anything. They never just volunteer any information. And they make code references to things. So that whole process of letting it sort of seep in and back up on itself, and then a little bit here, and then a little bit there, and the cumulative effect that memory has. You don't know what this image really was that you saw on Thursday, but a month from now, suddenly it has great significance, was not only what was going on with the characters, and in a sense, it was the narrator's urging and coddling, but it also took the structure, it informed the way in which the information is revealed.
And Beloved herself, the dead child who comes back as was a very fleshly ghost.
Yes.
Represents that process filling itself out almost like a balloon.
And she, at the moment when she is not allowed, I suppose, to sort of be the manifestation of their desire as a ghost and comes in there, or they believe she is the one that they have had some reason to want. Now your memory, now the history, now the past you can't avoid it now because it's sitting down next to you at the table, asking questions and being a general nuisance and out of control. So now you have to do something. You have to remember, or you have to collect it in such a way. And it's a total, fantastic construction because they make up stories about how she is theirs. She, of course, has her own agenda, quite different from theirs altogether. And I wanted her to be viable as both the manifestation, the spiritual, ghostly manifestation of memory and need, and at the same time to be a real survivor of a past that nobody remembers and nobody talks about, which is the survivors of those ships, which doesn't exist anywhere. And to have her traumatized from that, the possibility, so that when she talks about or makes reference in her mind about that experience, what she can remember of it from when she was a child, her language is the same language that she would use if she were in fact returned from the dead. It's the same language. So when they're talking to her about what was it like over there, and she tells them, they're speaking the same language.
And yet she has to be exorcised, and she has to go.
She has to do what ghosts need to do, which is they have to learn something, no? I mean, they can't, if they come back, they must come back for a reason, and she has to be chastised, exercised, and got rid of if they're going to go on, which is what one does with memory.
There's another thing that struck me was that the whole community of people in this book, all of whom can't and won't remember certain terrible things, all of them are full of an incredible sort of warmth and kindness in their tentative stepping, and they have this immense courtesy towards each other. Yes. Because they can't speak these things. But you only realise at the end of the book as a reader that it's in fact full of entirely good people. There's nobody in there who means ill except the ghost, because she bears the burden of the ill meaning. No black person who means ill to anyone.
No, they're quite comradely.
This is one of the exhilarating things.
Terribly dependent on one another, and even in their holding back, as they do from Setha, the distance they provide for her, even that runs out. I mean, they can easily effect a rescue when they think things have gone too far.
They begin to bring food when she's
That's right.
when
That's right.
beloved is starving her. It's all sort of. It is very simple. It is very simply written, and yet it is immensely intricate. There are all different kinds of voices and
yes.
languages in it. Do you have anybody from whom you feel you've learnt, or whose work you admire, that has influenced your prose style? Did it just spring up entirely?
I must have. I don't always know. I know painting's influence because there are things that I can see in paintings that I steal. I don't know what the painter had in mind, but it's something, the choices of colors, the arrangements of colors and so on, where there is space and where there is line. You know, whether, for me, it's the access to the scene is really a gesture, the sound, or a key, or in an image it's very wispy sometimes. But sometimes if I'm having difficulty with the entrance, I remember paintings. I also remember speech patterns, you know, sermons. I remember the relationship of musicians to the audience. So there are lots of things that are out of the text, non-textual things, that inform my effort to create text out of them, to make them, people speak biblically in the parabolic language when they have something important to say, and then the move from that into that which is ironic or funny, so that I can chart when that should take place. When I had a huge length of time and I could not write, was at the moment in the book when Setha goes home after Paul D has gone, and she locks that door and the three of them are in there alone, thinking and talking and so on. And I did Denver's section. I heard her voice, and I did Setha's, and I couldn't get Beloved's language, which means I couldn't see the way she would see things. So there was 3 or 4 months when I simply could not do that. So I didn't do it, and I did something else. And then I could hear it. I could hear the parts that are purely image of an 8-year-old in the body of a 20. You know,
could you read us a little bit of this language? It would be very.
Oh, sure.
If you could find us a bit of Beloved's voice. We want the colour as well, but
yeah, we'll start with the. Oh. All of it is now. It is always now. There will never be a time when I am not crouching and watching others who are crouching too. I am always crouching. The man on my face is dead. His face is not mine. His mouth smells sweet, but his eyes are locked. Some who eat, nasty themselves. I do not eat. The men without skin bring us their morning water to drink. We have none. At night I cannot see the dead man on my face. Daylight comes through the cracks, and I can see his locked eyes. Her voice is all image, all picture, all picture. No, the only time she says anything that would be, that was terrible, or I felt bad, she doesn't ever say that. She says, a hot thing, like a burning thing. But everything she says is a picture. how it looked, how it was, or how it smelled. There's no sort of ramification, descriptive thought in between. There's
No
text.
judgment.
That's right, no judgment.
Yes. Final thing I'd like to ask before asking the audience about questions is, you were talking about painting, and one of the things that excited me about this book was the way you played with the word coloured,
Yes.
which both describes the coloured people who somehow have the vitality of colour.
Yes.
And then you extended it into the way in which they'd all been deprived of colour in their lives and of vision. And there's this marvellous motif
Yes.
of people seeking for colour, of
Yes,
baby
yes.
lying there,
Yeah, pondering color.
pondering colour
Yes,
on her
yes,
deathbed.
yes.
I did wonder if you could also read us the marvellous bit where
Oh, yes.
Sethe is talking
Yes.
about colour in life.
Oh, yes. I'm here. I lasted, and my girl come home. Now I can look at things again because she's here to see them too. After the shed, I stopped. Now in the morning, when I light the fire, I mean to look out the window to see what the sun is doing to the day. Does it hit the pump handle first or the spigot? See if the grass is gray-green or brown or what. Now I know why Baby Suggs pondered color her last years. She never had time to see, let alone enjoy it before. Took her a long time to finish with blue, then yellow, then green. She was well into pink when she died. I don't believe she wanted to get to red, and I understand why, because me and Beloved outdid ourselves with it. Matter of fact, that and her pinkish headstone was the last color I recall. Now I'll be on the lookout. Think what spring will be for us. I'll plant carrots just so she can see them, and turnips. Have you ever seen one, baby? A prettier thing God never made. White and purple with a tender tail and a hard head. Feels good when you hold it in your hand, and smells like the creek when it floods, bitter but happy. We'll smell them together, beloved, beloved, because you're mine, and I have to show you these things and teach you what a mother should.
Could I ask you if you feel that white readers cannot fully understand your experience unless they read much more fully, not just other black writers or perhaps slave narratives, but perhaps even some of the political polemic from the civil rights movement onwards?
I suspect that anybody's understanding of my work would be enhanced if they knew more about black culture. There are secrets there. Some of those things, I think, are sort of like inside jokes and perhaps only black people understand. Some of them are readily accessible to any sensitive reader. There are all sorts of things that are survivals in the culture from Africanisms. In other words, I guess what I'm saying is I think it bears study in the same way that I feel a broader knowledge of periods would help me to understand, I don't know, Gogol or Marguerite Duras. You know, there is another world outside that. But I don't think that white people are the only people who may need additional or be benefited by other kinds of reading. Slave narratives, however, I would imagine would be pertinent. Even though they were not fiction, they were narratives, they bore the weight, the political weight, that feeling that people bring to literature. which is, oh my God, do I have to feel this? So the necessity for trying to make it possible for the other to enter the text, not to alarm, not to overstate, not to forbid, that strategy that was used in the narratives is part of what many black writers are still struggling with in fiction and in other work. We generally receive, our work has always been called sensational or violent or something. The subject matter is certainly that. The writing isn't, so that those are the problems. I think it's beneficial, but I am not always sure that cultural differences are always there, and it's not always skin that makes the difference in whether one has full appreciation. I remember the first line I wrote, quiet as is kept, there were no marigolds in the fall of 1941, which is the opening sentence of The Bluest Eye. Now that is just a sentence that says what it says, and it may be nice enough, but I know, and this is very regional, black women gossiping over the fence in the backyard always said, quiet as is kept. And then they would tell a huge lie, terrible gossip about some relationship they'd probably invented. So using that, and some people, maybe 10 or 12, have said, quiet as is kept, and if you launch it, well, it isn't necessary for the readers to know that particular turn of phrase, the general reader, black or white. It's sort of fun if you have been in a northern Ohio in 1940s and heard it, then you can sort of get it. But I think that's true of everybody's writing. There are all these hidden things that other people have greater access to.
Gentleman at the back.
Yes, we're a group of American students here that were studying Black American literature, and we've just finished reading a book by Wright called Native Son. And I was wondering, I was reading an article about you, and you said that in Beloved, you wanted to write about self-murder and the way in which we sabotage ourselves. Do you see any connection between that and, say, something like Native Son?
Richard Wright, has an unassailable place in the history of black literature. His agenda was clear. I don't have quite the same interests. I think, what I think is that women writers in the States, black women writers, are probably the only people who are writing who have a gaze unlike white male writers, black male writers, and white women writers. I don't mean it's better, I'm just talking about the gaze. In this sense, white men are interested in each other, which is legitimate. I mean, that's what they should be interested in. I mean, they write about what they think and feel and do and solve, etc. White women are interested in white men also, because those are their sons, their brothers, their fathers. That's what their life is about. Black men, including Richard Wright, are also interested in white men because that's the enemy. That's the one they're measuring their masculinity, their intelligence, their rights, their power against. So it's all a legitimate geography. It is interesting to me and curious to me that black women are not. They're the only ones writing who are interested in black women and black men. And white men, even when they're somebody's husband, don't seem to figure or loom large in the text. Now, I don't think anybody sort of sat down and thought about that, but what it has done, it has just freed up the literature to talk about something else.
Can I ask you what you think of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is the only book in the time that really tackled what the others were very elegantly not saying with their reversals of black and white.
Well, I was always disappointed in that book. I have got to read it again because somebody told me I was missing something really important. I think because, I don't mean its consequences, but it was interesting, broad stroke though it may be, and it is broad strokes, and perhaps Mr. Henson should have written the book himself, the one that she presumably based it on. But it had the structure. I think the disappointment was the absence of subtlety. I was very young when I read that book. And there was nothing to compare it with except, I guess, Birth of a Nation. So we're talking about an arid place in which white writers who would appropriate or confront the subject would do it almost in cartoon strokes, almost like cartoons. And then try to deal with the language in that sort of funny way, have people say "ub" instead of. You know, you can come from any place in the world and have an accent, and no one will try to phonetically transcribe it. But for black people, they always have some problem with spelling for some reason. You can, there was just some wonderful slave interviews of slaves that did the Federal Writers Project and so on, and they recorded in the 30s all these people who had been slaves or were the children of slaves, and they had these volumes of that stuff at Harvard. Now, and the people say no or naw, and they write N-A-I-A-U. The white people in the South, who also say naw, they spell that N-O. They talk the same. I mean, there's a difference in the twang. They never try to do that. And the only time you ever see it done seriously is when Shaw did, you know, tried to do, what's her name's?
Oh, Eliza Doolittle.
Eliza
Yes.
Doolittle.
Yes.
And then he abandoned it after he got his point across, you know, that, and that's what the play was about, really, wasn't it? So he stopped doing it. But that is always, that burden has always been there. It happens in many books. I have writers who have done it. Alex Haley does it. You know, you have a poor white talking to a poor black, and the spelling changes. So, where I started off with, Uncle Tom's Cabin. So that, you know, and, you know, Zora Neale Hurston does it, you know. What they're trying to do is to say there's something going on with the language. It's different. But they don't know. I know what the difference is now, after I fooled with it a little while. It's a rhythm, and where you place the metaphors. It's the nature of that particular kind of concrete metaphor, or simile, or the image. That's where it is. It's not in words that don't exist. I've never in my life heard any black person in the whole world say gwine. Ever. It's in all the literature.
The authorities tell me that, alas, we have to draw to a conclusion. I should like, I think on behalf of all of us, to thank you very, very much.